What has happened in this reset day in the beta wasn't just the long-awaited set of changes to Shaman as a whole, but also the remaining set of balance changes and tuning to the other specs. So today we're gonna call this a, generally speaking, positive set of changes with mostly buffs, with a handful of what you can call nerfs coming to a few specs, and that's what we have to start with, because the first change in question is to Sun Lane hero talent for DK. It's for Unholy and Blood DK, but really the problem here was Unholy. You have the Blood is Life accumulator AoE damage, as well as the AoE damage of the Blood Beast that is spawned do reduced AoE damage beyond 8 targets, and the Blood is Life blow up cannot crit anymore. This was doing pretty relevant damage in AoE, but for more nerfs, especially in single target, the Essence of the Blood Queen, stacking haste buff, which can then also stack even higher and then gets doubled in effectiveness, now gives you less haste, from 1.5 per stack to 1% per stack, and then Infliction of Sorrow gets further nerfed again. Now the damage is 10% of the remaining dot damage instead of 20%, and then Vampiric Strike itself is also nerfed by 15%. This is still quite a relevant set of changes given the current power of Unholy in the beta, which is pretty much the overall better performing DPS spec. Who isn't the better performing DPS spec without being, terrible, but definitely not one of the best, was Frost DK. The largest set of changes is down their auto-attack talent line in the middle, particularly to Icy Death Torrent. The damage is doubled, higher chance to proc whenever you crit, with a guaranteed chance if you're playing two-handed Frost DK. Now it also scales with Mastery, and your Frost DK Mastery is Frost damage, so of course it's gonna work on this talent as well, with the only negative of doing reduced damage beyond 8 targets, which is a definitely good compromise considering the original modifier of this talent was 40% of your attack power. Now it's up to 160%, 4 times as much, plus now scales with Mastery as well. So far higher damage to this talent, as well as 6 extra seconds of Pillar of Frost. Now you can bring it up to an 18-second buff on a 45-second cooldown, plus the extra strength buff after it expires. You also have the Untaken set of talents down the Razorize Trigger Explosion line, which is practically the least taken for Frost DK. Even in AoE, it's not performing nearly as well. The whole point of this line is to make Howling Blast apply Razorize in AoE. Once you have 5 stacks, Frost Strike is going to consume that in single target and then also blow it up in AoE. The problem though is that all of this is just too little damage. Even by AoE standards, you don't get to use Howling Blast enough times to stack this to 5 fast enough for the explosions to do meaningful damage in AoE. So this is being buffed, but I doubt it's going to stay relevant, especially if at the same time you buff these two by even more, and you also buff Hyperpyrexia even more, increasing the chance to trigger and then also increasing the additional damage to your abilities when it procs. And then to focus even more on your auto-attack damage, Smothering Offense gets buffed again. So it's an overall good set of changes for Frost DK. We have, however, to go back to the nerfs we mentioned of Unholy with Sun Lane, because that's just not enough. Unholy also gets nerfed in pretty much everything they have by 10 to 15%. Again, still expected and warranted. Then we have a bit of a sad set of changes to Balanced Druid. You do have the hero talents also slightly changed. Eluna's Chosen in particular is being buffed across the board. But we have a bigger problem than this, because Balanced Druid, as you can see here, gets quite a lot of positive changes, right? Especially changes that might make your rotation a bit smoother, like for example, Astral Communion now giving you more astral power when you enter Eclipse, or Eluna's Guidance reducing the astral power cost of your spenders even more. Some mixed changes like slightly nerfing the crit strike of Rotten Starfire, as well as the damage of Umbral Embrace, but then buffing up Umbral Intensity's damage bonuses of Rotten Starfire, as well as the damage of Stellar Flare. A few other positive changes like Orbit Breaker taking fewer shooting stars to pop a full moon, as well as Convoke now being more likely to cast Star Surge, also positive. All of this positiveness comes at the cost of having your overall damage reduced by 5%. Now this, however, is not the main negative part of the changes to balance. The changes to balance are negative because right now the spec is terrible. It plays terribly, even worse than it uses to, and it's not that balance is already known for being quite the complicated spec or for having quite the satisfying or compelling rotation. Balance is quite firmly in the brain rot category of rotation, even if you're playing with Keeper of the Grove and your Treants, or if you're playing without them, we are still talking about very, very simplistic playstyle. And the problem remains in your talent choices. Your talent tree at this point, now that we are done complaining about rogues because they got reworked, shaman because it got reworked, hunter because it got reworked, who's next in line possibly could be balanced druid. You can already see your options of untaken talents are quite few. There are not many of them, and most of these are going to be situational. For example, Twin Moons only taken if you're fighting, a couple of targets, or Soul of the Forest and Wild Mushroom taken if you're in an AoE situation. You have a couple of talents or previous legendary effects nerfed so much you just don't bother taking them anymore. Passive effects that really do nothing for your rotation, and you only play them if your simulation tells you they do more damage than another talent, otherwise you just ignore them. So once these get out of the picture, your actual options to play differently are very, very few. And even though most of the changes were positive, besides the 5% nerf, they don't actually change much of this. In fact, if anything, things are getting worse, because if you are playing with Eluna's Chosen, which is now being buffed by quite a lot, still, the best and most efficient way to play Eluna's Chosen was to play with Lunar Calling, which has now been actually buffed even more. And this is a problem because it makes your rotation even simpler and even more straightforward by practically using Starfire in all situations now, because now it's gonna beat Wrath even in single target. So this is actually not making it better for you, it's making your rotation even more simple and even more straightforward with even fewer options to choose. So TLDR of balance right now is not good, even after you could say in general the changes could be seen as overall positive. Hunter gets a couple of reasonable changes. You get your new knock-up implosive trap cooldown from 90 seconds to 60 seconds, which is good. You have single target buffs to marksmanship. You get buffed by 10% in your single target abilities, but the trick shot effectiveness is reduced, which means these two will do less damage in AoE after being buffed by 10%. So it's a more relevant buff in single target than for AoE, for marksmanship. Survival gets reverted to its old Mungo's Fury version from 3 stacks up to 5 stacks, and the duration also getting longer, with the addition now that Bloody Claws also causes your kill command to extend the duration of your Mungo's Fury. Nothing really that relevant for survival. What is more relevant are the changes to Arcane. So first, something we mentioned last time was the OP-ness of Spell Slinger, particularly for Arcane, and in particular Spell's Frost Teachings when it came to your Arcane Charges generation, as well as free procs of Arcane Orb. This is getting slightly nerfed. Surprising that the actual damage of Spell Slinger isn't nerfed, because that is quite significant damage for Arcane. It can get upwards of 1/4 of your entire damage coming just from Spell Slinger, which is not really getting nerfed significantly. Just Spell's Frost Teachings damage bonus from 20 to 10% is not really that relevant of a nerf. Now, Arcane gets nerfed in numbers, but the QOL improvement of their talent tree is significant. So yes, you're getting Arcane Barrage, Arcane Orb, and Arcane Blast nerfed by 10% and 15% for Arcane Orb. What is more relevant is that now you get some talents for free. You get Mana Adept, now becoming a baseline passive of your Arcane spec. You also get Siphon Storm, now as a base effect of your evocation, no longer a detached talent you have to take after evocation. What's also good, talking about the QOL of your talent tree, is that now evocation is no longer on the side of your tree and also requiring presence of mind to take, and also Siphon Storm if you wanted to turn this into a proper cooldown. Now it's right after Touch of the Magi, which you take 100% of the time. So basically now you have a very, very easy way to get yourself a damage cooldown. Compared to before, where it was a bit to the side, costed you a total of 3, talent points to get to Evocation and then to get to Siphon Storm. Now it only costs 1, and it's very easy to get. And on top of that, Mana Adept is given to you for free. Also, Chrono Shift, as well as a couple of more boring talents like Crackling Energy, and then the compensation of the buff to Arcane Missiles, losing out on improved Arcane Missiles, those are all being removed from your talent tree. This is good. It's good because now, first of all, you have a much more straightforward set of AoE talents. They have now all been put in the right side of your tree. Practically all of these, besides these couple, are all for AoE. So now you have your category of AoE here, besides perhaps just Ether Attunement. Every other thing AoE related is down this side. You have lost 2 to 3 boring or simply not taken talents, and a couple of other talents you would have wanted have now been given to you for free. So you have 2 more points to spend now. So yes, you have gotten your damage nerfed, which, much like Unholy, was necessary, but now your pathing through your talent tree is actually improved. We do have a very slight buff to fire. Perhaps Blizzard was a bit too heavy-handed in nerfing fire after their initial performance in the beta, and continued buffs to frost, which continues to do poorly, at least compared to the other 2 mage specs. Now, the major change of the day, which doesn't change anything to anyone in terms of playstyle, is the fact that Retribution Aura has been removed. Very simple footnote by Blizzard. As part of our process of examining raid buffs, we have come to the decision to remove Ret Aura in order to reduce restrictions on group compositions. So pretty much, Paladins, if you want to get angry at someone, get angry at Shaman. Because Blizzard gave a raid buff to Shaman and they said, well, we don't really want to have double Paladin as a mandatory pick in the raid as well, so we better just remove one of the 2 raid buffs of Paladin. There is somewhat of an interesting change to Priest, which continues to get its Voidweaver hero talent nerfed. Now, after nerfing Void Blast by 25% in damage, now Entropic Rift also gets nerfed by 25% in damage. Still understandable, slightly, for Shadow Priest, a little bit less, again, when it comes to Discipline, who continues to get this Voidweaver 3 nerfed, while also being the weakest healer currently in the beta, which is somewhat weird. We then have all of the changes about Shaman we just had an entire video about. We will come back on this probably tomorrow or in a couple of days just to see all of the talents fully implemented for Shaman and to see how they have been working in the beta, especially after the raid testing of today. Now, the last of the significant changes are happening to Warlock. Not to Affliction, this is mostly just some tooltip clarity you were going to take as part of Hellcaller both of these talents regardless. You weren't going to choose one of these 2. What is more relevant are the changes to Demo. So, Demo is receiving some pretty good buffs. However, these are not the good buffs we're talking about. Yes, Felguard getting a free charge when using Soul Strike and moving around these talents is positive, especially kicking Sacrifice Souls all the way back to the 5th row, rather than being at the very bottom of your tree, so you free up a talent point at the bottom of your tree rather than having to take this one. It is a positive change, as well as Housemaster Gambit now being the logical prerequisite of Flame Touched, since the Gambit buffs your Dreadstalkers and Flame Touched buffs your Dreadstalkers. The real positive are a couple of things. Number 1, bug fixes. Number 1, the fact that these talents actually work now. The fact that your dogs now can actually be played on full power, as you can see in the beta. The other thing that's been going down is that after making pretty much playable Soul Harvester, Demo Warlocks have found out a thing that will obviously be nerfed soon, but right now Demolocks are on full copium, trying to explain why this is totally normal. Basically, Demo has a completely undertaken talent nobody cares about, which is Shadow Invocation. Every time you do damage, you have a chance to spawn a bomber. Now, Demo is not exactly a fast-hitting spec with multiple dots that can trigger this very, very often. So it was never really played. On top of that, this one blacklisted Implosion, so made Implosion not able to trigger this, which was the one that was going to hit the most targets at once to make Shadow Invocation powerful, so this was terrible. However, once more Warlocks started playing with Soul Harvester, they realized that once you get a Succulent Soul to empower Hand of Gul'dan is going to double hit. So it's going to hit twice. that's not all. Because then, after double hitting, Soul Anathema is going to put on all of the targets hit by that Succulent Soul empowered Hand of Gul'dan a 10-second dot. And if that's not enough, every time you consume a demonic core, you also trigger Soul Anathema. And on top of that, you have Shared Fate. Whenever one of the enemies die, you get to spread another dot. So now suddenly you find yourself playing Demo with two different ways to apply a 10-second dot in AoE. And those dots right now are not blacklisted from Shadow Invocation, which means they can trigger bombers every single time they tick. As a simple example, imagine you're fighting 10 targets as a Soul Harvester Demo lock, and you are casting a Succulent Soul empowered Hand of Gul'dan. Hand of Gul'dan will be cast and hit 10 targets, and then because it is a Succulent Soul Hand of Gul'dan, is going to have an extra explosion hitting 10 targets again, and then the 10 targets hit by the Succulent Soul will have a 10-second dot applied on them. So you will have 10 hits from the Hand of Gul'dan, 10 hits from the Succulent Soul proc, and then 50 hits from the 5 ticks of the dot on each of the 10 targets. This will total out to be 70 hits. Each of those 70 hits has a 20% chance to spawn a bomber, which totals out to 14 bombers being spawned. That is the TLDR of the situation right now of Demolocks playing Soul Harvester in AoE. It's a lot of damage, and the copium angle of Demolock is that no, this is actually not a bug, it's working properly. Yes, it is, but you know very well that by the next set of balance tuning, these two will be blacklisted from being able to be triggered by Shadow Invocation. So that's the thing happening to Demo, not actually the positive changes in here, but rather the bug fixes, making your Dreadstalkers actually do proper damage with the talents now, as well as this Soul Harvester plus Shadow Invocation combo for Demo. Finishing now with the last of the meaningful changes to Fury. This is, again, not really something in-depth about talents, new talents being moved around, just numbers. You have more damage to Rampage, Raging Blow, Bloodthirst, Odin's Fury. Practically your main damage dealers are all getting buffed. And that's also warranted because Fury was amongst some of the underperforming specs in the beta right now. So with this, we have gone through the latest round of balance tuning update in the new build of the beta of the War Within. As mentioned, most of the changes being positive, with a handful of negative changes here and there, with the spotlight of the nerfed spec being Unholy, both to the spec but also to their hero talent of choice. So with this out of the way, on this Wednesday, we are now saying goodbye to each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video, but also for everyone who is supporting by liking and commenting down below on the video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys probably tomorrow, and in the meantime, I got baited by Hopium. Looking at the weather, today is cold, 17 degrees, and then 32 degrees for the end of the week.